I walked into my office on a Monday morning feeling something was terribly wrong, and within minutes I discovered the horrible truth that would change everything. Fresh graduates, barely out of college, were being paid 50% more than me despite working at the company for 7 long years, sacrificing countless weekends and late nights. I overheard people casually discussing it in the break room, and the words cut deep into my heart like a knife. My hands trembled as I stared at my paycheck, trying to understand how this could possibly happen after everything I had given to the company. The unfairness was crushing, and for the first time in my professional life, I felt the sting of real betrayal. Instead of losing my temper or storming into the CEO's office to demand an explanation, I made a decision that would set me on a completely different path. I chose silence, and I chose to observe everything around me with the eyes of someone who was beginning to understand a game I had not known I was playing. Day after day, I sat quietly at my desk, watching how promotions were given not to the hardest workers, but to the people who were most charming and most favored by management. I noticed patterns that others had missed and began to understand that the company was being run poorly by people who did not deserve their positions. I started keeping a notebook where I wrote down everything I observed, every error made by management, and every decision that seemed careless or unfair. My quiet demeanor meant that nobody suspected what I was doing behind my calm exterior. I was gathering evidence, piece by piece, building a collection of facts that would eventually become very important. Every email I noticed and every mistake I witnessed went into my mental filing system, organized and ready to be used. One evening, alone in my car in the parking lot, I reviewed everything I had documented and realized that what I had discovered was not just random mistakes, but actual leverage. I had found weaknesses in the system, gaps in oversight, and areas where the CEO and his management team had made errors that could bring serious consequences to the company. I had noticed how small missteps were covered up by friendly managers and how the CEO ignored warning signs that could eventually cause the entire company to fall apart. That night, I began to test my ideas subtly, dropping small hints during meetings and watching carefully to see who would react. As weeks passed, I spent my late nights in the office going through reports, spreadsheets, and emails with extreme care and attention. I discovered that the CEO's decisions were often made based on intuition rather than proper analysis, that approvals had been skipped without any real reason, and that errors were going uncorrected. I began to print out important documents and organize them carefully by department, creating a physical record of every oversight I could find. In my mind, I was building a story that would eventually need to be told to the right people at the right time. The plan forming in my mind was not about revenge in the traditional sense. Instead, it was about strategy, timing, and patience. I wanted to show the company and its leadership that they should never have underestimated someone like me. As I sat alone in the quiet office late at night, I whispered to myself, they have been careless for years. I just need to find the right moment to show them what they have done. Then one evening, I noticed a financial report that contained a significant error, something important enough to shake the CEO's entire sense of control. During a casual meeting the next day, I made a point of mentioning a small discrepancy I had found in one of the company reports. I watched as the CEO stiffened in his chair and the HR manager froze for just a moment, and I knew that my words had created exactly the effect I wanted. I did not say anything more, understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say just enough to create doubt and then step back. Later that afternoon, I sat at my desk and began cross-checking all of the errors I had found, making careful notes about which ones could be used strategically. As time went on, I watched the new graduates being celebrated for accomplishments that seemed shallow to me. I began to discreetly record their mistakes, paying attention to how they were getting promoted based not on actual performance, but on how well they fit into the company culture. Each email I found where someone made a careless decision became another piece of evidence to add to my growing digital file. By evening, my folder of evidence had grown significantly, and I began to see the bigger picture forming. One day, a report was misfiled in a way that drew attention to a mistake that had been made weeks earlier. I had made sure that the right people would notice this error without anyone realizing that I had been involved. I watched as the CEO tried to dismiss it publicly, but I could see the discomfort in his eyes. I documented his reaction carefully, understanding that how people responded to pressure could tell me a lot about where the real vulnerabilities were. I began to map out the CEO's entire operation, understanding that his power was not based on his own intelligence, but on his dependence on his assistants and middle managers. I identified blind spots in his knowledge and began sending routine reminder emails that subtly highlighted errors. Meanwhile, I had discovered something even bigger, a hidden contract error that could potentially cause serious legal and financial problems for the entire company. As my strategy became more sophisticated, I started to focus on the CEO's insecurities. I knew he cared deeply about his public image, about what investors thought of him, and about whether his employees were loyal. I began to imagine different scenarios in my head, playing out how one small mistake could start a chain reaction that would eventually bring everything down. During a morning briefing, a junior manager presented a report that I had previously flagged as containing errors, and now those errors were impossible to ignore. The CEO stiffened immediately, and while he tried to wave it off publicly, I could feel the tension spreading through the room. One of my colleagues subtly highlighted the consequences of these errors, planting seeds of doubt without revealing that this was all part of my plan. Over the following weeks, I refined my approach further, sending internal suggestions with small corrections that were always framed as helpful. My colleagues unknowingly became carriers of the consequences of the errors I highlighted, spreading awareness of the company's problems. Each day, the CEO's confidence seemed to falter as he dealt with one problem after another. I kept careful track of everything, noting every reaction and every change in body language. I made a careful decision about which of my colleagues could be trusted with fragments of evidence. Some were too naive, while others were too ambitious. Finally, I found one carefully chosen ally, someone I could work with to map out potential problems. I made a conscious choice to ignore casual provocations and office gossip, understanding that silence was more powerful than any kind of direct confrontation. Each careless comment made by new hires or managers was carefully documented and filed away. While I stayed quiet, the CEO continued to make increasingly overconfident decisions, unaware of the growing file of evidence being compiled against him. As weeks and months passed, errors seemed to compound and multiply. I created a detailed timeline that showed patterns of repeated negligence, where every overlooked approval was linked to real consequences for the company. I could see the invisible cracks beginning to form in the company's structure, and I understood that all that remained was waiting for exactly the right moment. Then something unexpected happened that would accelerate my timeline. A miscommunication between departments escalated into a complaint from an important client. The CEO's lack of oversight became obvious to everyone, and I had orchestrated the documentation without directly involving myself. As the CEO scrambled to fix the problem, public perception began to shift. I stayed in the shadows, simply observing the initial ripple of concern moving through the executive team. A mid-level manager who had previously stayed neutral discovered one of the errors that I had documented, and without realizing it, he confirmed everything I had been tracking. I captured the proof quietly, and this unplanned alignment suddenly accelerated my entire plan. The CEO remained oblivious to how much danger he was actually in, but I could feel the tension in the office beginning to rise. During a live meeting, the CEO nearly caught a discrepancy himself, and I had to act quickly to deflect suspicion, maintaining my composure even though my heart was racing. I understood that a single mistake on my part could compromise months of careful planning. But rather than making me nervous, the risk reinforced my confidence because I was seeing that the mistakes were exposing themselves naturally. As more and more errors became public knowledge throughout the company, investors and department heads started asking questions that the CEO could not answer satisfactorily. I stayed completely behind the scenes, strategically dropping hints. The CEO's arrogance, which had once been his strength, was now becoming his greatest blind spot, causing him to make increasingly reckless decisions. Every time he tried to assert control without understanding the problems, he ended up exposing even more mistakes. Finally, I compiled all of the incidents I had documented into one comprehensive dossier that told a clear and compelling story. I organized everything chronologically, and every single point was backed up with emails, timestamps, and witnesses. The pattern of incompetence and negligence was absolutely undeniable. I had proof of systemic failures, proof of negligence, and proof of favoritism running throughout the company. During meetings, I began to leak subtle insights that allowed other people to discover the consequences of bad decisions naturally. Managers started questioning the CEO's decisions, and small conflicts began to break out in the executive team. The CEO's confidence began to visibly crack. I maintained my silence, understanding that sometimes the most effective thing is to let other people act as carriers of the truth. The CEO tried to assert dominance by issuing commands and making decisions, but because he did not understand the real problems, these commands ended up exposing even more mistakes. His attempts to regain control actually had the opposite effect, making him look weaker with every action he took. My plan accelerated as his arrogance blinded him completely. A major financial error surfaced that was tied directly to the CEO's own oversight. The CEO panicked, trying to blame junior employees and middle managers for the problem. But everyone could see that the responsibility ultimately lay with him. I stayed completely calm, my dossier ready and organized, waiting for exactly the right moment. The office buzzed with speculation about how these mistakes could have accumulated for so long. Finally, I decided that the moment had come. I took the comprehensive dossier I had compiled, with every document carefully organized and highlighted. I left it on the CEO's desk, arranged so that it would be impossible to miss. Then I sent a concise email to the board of directors, summarizing the risks that the company faced and the patterns of negligence that had been overlooked. The evidence I presented was completely undeniable. The CEO read through my dossier with widening eyes, and for the first time, he truly understood the extent of what had happened. Silence filled the office as people waited to see what would happen next. My colleagues began to whisper, speculating about what was in my dossier. The board called an emergency meeting, and questions about accountability began to fly. The CEO, who had once seemed untouchable, was now on the defensive. The company's reputation was damaged, and the board was forced to confront the reality that the leadership had failed. I watched from my desk, composed, and finally feeling free from the humiliation. Weeks later, the company announced that there would be internal restructuring, and the CEO resigned, claiming personal reasons. Accountability and fairness became central themes in the company's operations. My career was finally recognized, my loyalty was validated, and my intelligence was respected. I had remained patient, strategic, and completely legal in everything I had done. Sitting in my office, I reflected on what had happened and realized that revenge was not about anger or punishment. It was about timing, composure, and having the confidence to let evidence speak louder than words.